Welcome back to Newsmax Now. President Obama meeting with King Salman today in Saudi Arabia as U.S.-Saudi relations start to show some cracks. In a private meeting that lasted 2 hours, President Obama and King Salman discussed the various conflicts around the Middle East, as well as U.S. concerns about human rights in Saudi Arabia. But things are getting tense. Saudi Arabia opposes President Obama's outreach to Iran, and they're also skeptical over his approach to the crisis in Syria. They have also threatened to sell $750 billion of U.S. assets if Congress passes a bill allowing families of September 11th terror attacks to sue the Saudis. Of course, 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. Meanwhile, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee called for the release of the classified portion, the so-called 28 pages, of the congressional investigation into the September 11th attacks. Some have said that would implicate the Saudis in being complicit with these attacks, or at least help plan them. Adam Schiff, who is that top Democrat on the panel, says the reality, though, of the 9/11 report is actually less damaging than the rumors swirling around.
And that's what we're going to bring in today's roundtable. Joining us now, we have Raul Mas. He's a political and economic analyst, also the CEO of Gladius Consulting. We also have with us Kyle Harrington, the founder and managing partner of Harrington Capital Management. Thank you both for joining us here on Newsmax Now.
Thank you.
And we're going to take some viewer calls in just a minute. But first, Raul, if the Saudis were to sell $750 billion of U.S. assets, what would that actually mean for our economy?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think my perspective, call their bluff. And it's exactly what it is. It's just a bluff. It's as anybody who has any knowledge of the bond markets will tell you, they will be crushed, absolutely crushed, and they will do more damage to themselves if they try to sell a large quantity of bonds or any type of security in short order. Bond traders are very, very savvy individuals. They're like sharks in the water. They smell blood. And the ones who will end up taking it on the chin will be the Saudis themselves in terms of the value of their holdings. And by the way, that $750 million number, highly skeptical. The numbers that I've seen is that the entire holdings of U.S. Treasuries in the entire Middle East region is somewhere short of about $300 billion. So that number is highly inflated. And, they'd only be hurting themselves. Remember, too, that petroleum prices are denominated in dollars, right? So anything that they do that damages the U.S. dollar is also going to damage their own pocketbook in a very, very big way.
Well, Kyle, there's some precedent here because the Saudis have flooded the global oil market with cheap oil. It's come down in price, so they're paying for that as well. And why hasn't the Obama administration simply called them on their bluff?
Well, first of all, I agree 100% with Raul. I think for them to enter that market and sell that level of securities, if in fact that's the level, I think that they're doing more damage to themselves from a valuation perspective than anything else. Secondarily, your question about why is Obama not doing anything, I think this is a perfect example where politics meets economics. And, there is I'm surprised that he hasn't been more aggressive in his tone, although this is sort of par for the course for our current president about not really hammering home what American interests are and protecting American assets to the degree by which I think we are used to historically in the United States.
Well, I want to go back to this legislation that's apparently in the works, but now it's stalled a little bit with these victims of 9/11 possibly suing Saudi Arabia. What's the likelihood, because this isn't the first time this has come up, what's the likelihood of this actually happening?
Well, look, I think the fear is that supposedly if we do not give sort of sovereign immunity to the country of Saudi Arabia, that therefore they can then do it to us and other countries can do the same thing. However, as I understand it, this legislation is very narrowly crafted to talk about specific terrorist attacks on specific, on U.S. soil. And I think, quite frankly, the legislation should pass. I mean, what the Saudis are doing, and mind you, the Saudis are considered our allies. If telling your ally that you're going to sell off $750 billion of your debt is something in the neighborhood of friendship, it sounds more like extortion to me. I sympathize with the widows that are calling for this legislation. I lost 2 friends in the World Trade Center. This is personal for me. And so I say, let the chips fall where they may, and let's get to the bottom of this and go ahead and pass that legislation and make it narrowly defined. And let's find out exactly what are in those 28 pages of hidden testimony that never made the public eye as to Saudi involvement in 9/11.
there's a lot going on here. We have a long relationship with the Saudis and the House of Saud, the royal family there. And it's always kind of been, you guys give us cheap oil and we'll overlook a lot of human rights violations and a lot of other stuff, including supporting radical Islamists and Wahhabism. Do we still need, Kyle, a relationship with the Saudis, or can we turn our back and look elsewhere?
Not as much, I believe, as we used to. We don't need that relationship as much, and I tell you why. If we can, for example, get together and formulate this Keystone Pipeline and become less dependent on the Saudis. I mean, that's the goal. Everybody talks about that. Become less dependent on oil from the Middle East. And I think that the leverage clearly changes, and that's the goal. I think that there's a lot of natural resources here in the States, and I'd like to see something like the Keystone Pipeline be more advanced so that we can examine in more detail just how much less dependent we can become on Saudi Arabia. I also agree with Raul again on I'm for that legislation. I'd like to see what's in those documents, because if in fact there is, I also lost two very close friends of mine in 9/11, so this is near and dear to my heart. And so I would like to very much see the investigation continue about what exactly is in those documents.
Yeah, it does seem interesting that the legislation has all of a sudden kind of stalled a little bit, in that it's come up before, now it's coming up again.
I think it actually seems kind of natural to me that there would be rumors of the legislation stalling on the eve of the president's visit to Saudi Arabia to say, look, we're putting the brakes on this. Maybe things will change when they get back to this country. I just want to ask you guys, would either of you be surprised? There's a lot of rumors out there about how much knowledge members of the Saudi royal family and the Saudi government had about 9/11. Would either of you be surprised if those two dots were connected in these 28 pages? We only got about a minute left. First to you, Raul, and then to Kyle.
Absolutely not. I mean, I think if follow the money for one thing. I mean, look at all the billions of dollars that Saudi Arabia spends on lobbyists and K Street lobbyists to promote their interests in this country, and ask yourself why these 28 pages haven't come out before. I mean, there's something in there that implicates some high-ranking people, maybe not a direct, link to the monarchs themselves, but there's a lot of people in Saudi Arabia that contributed to foundations that promoted Osama bin Laden and eventually contributed to the attacks on 9/11, and that's what they're trying to hide.
All right, Kyle, we got to go. We got to get to a commercial break, but stand by. We're going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit more about another important economic issue.
Yeah, one of the options on the table when it comes to Puerto Rico is a bailout, but we want to know if you think that's the best use of our taxpayer dollars. Give us a call right now, 877 Newsmax. Welcome back to Newsmax Now. I'm Miranda Kahn. Several high-ranking Republicans are speaking out against new legislation aimed at helping Puerto Rico's fiscal crisis. Senator Orrin Hatch, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, says the new rules are not satisfactory and won't pass in the upper chamber. Some conservative House Republicans are also upset with one element of the bill. It would allow Puerto Rico to cut repayments to its creditors without their consent. Of course, this comes as House Speaker Paul Ryan and other congressional leaders work with President Obama to try and advance the new measure to help Puerto Rico deal with its $70 billion debt. Now, the Center for Individual Freedom is adding fuel to this fire with this new anti-bailout commercial.
Washington is trying to pull a fast one. The Obama administration and leaders in Congress want to bail out Puerto Rico. It's called Super Chapter 9, and it grants Puerto Rico unprecedented bankruptcy protections. You pay for it. Retirement accounts crushed. A bailout on the backs of savers and seniors. Washington politicians try to claim otherwise, but we know a bad bailout when we see one. Don't be fooled. No Super Chapter 9 bailout of Puerto Rico.
And that's where we'd like to welcome back today's roundtable.
That dastardly Washington, always trying to pull a fast one. Rejoining us, we have Raul Mas, a political and economic analyst, the CEO of Gladius Consulting. Also with us, Kyle Harrington, the founder and managing partner of Harrington Capital Management. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. So the question remains, I guess there's some meeting going on Capitol Hill, aides of Paul Ryan and some of those top congressional members trying to rally around and get this bill going. Will there be a bailout of Puerto Rico, Raul?
Listen, there's no real easy choices in this one, John. I mean, if you think about it, somebody's going to have to be stuck with a bill here, and it's either going to be creditors who were sold Puerto Rican bonds that were supposedly investment grade, AAA type of paper, and are now being asked to sort of, well, gee, guess what? That federal government guarantee or the fact that Puerto Rico is a federal territory doesn't really mean much. Or U.S. taxpayers. One or the other is going to have to take it on the chin. There's no easy solutions here. But all of this is proof positive of, what happens when you have government spending and government regulation run amok. $72 billion in debt. The island of Puerto Rico, as much as its entire gross domestic product, 40%, of the population not working or looking for work. Unemployment north of 12%. Burdensome regulations at all levels. It's a mess, and people fleeing the island and coming to the United States to try and find a job.
Right. Yeah, and 25% of those people actually work for the government. Here's what I'm confused about, because Puerto Rico is not a state. Congress, I believe, oversees Puerto Rico. So shouldn't Congress be to blame? Kyle?
That's a good question. At the end of the day, one of the things you have to ask yourself, they haven't even released their 2014 audited financial statements yet.
It's a big mess. It's a big mess, Raul, and I think a lot of Americans, I totally understand your point about, the full faith and credit of the U.S. government backing these bonds. There is that issue aside, but as a taxpayer, we're all sick and tired of the ones taking the haircut on these types of deals. I want to bring in Rocky, who wants to talk about this, and Kyle, we'll get your response to Rocky's statement. Rocky's joining us from North Dakota. Rocky, thanks for being with us. What's your comment?
Well, I just think it's a horribly bad idea. I mean, obviously, you're talking $70 billion, and it's not just Puerto Rico. It's going to be a domino effect, because you can look across the United States. How many municipalities have claimed bankruptcy the last 3-4 years? How many more will be on the verge of it right now? How many states are nearly insolvent? Look at California. I mean, we cannot afford to keep bailing out what is this fiscal irresponsibility and spend and promising pensions and huge pension, and they're all unfunded liabilities. This is insanity.
Yeah, Kyle, and Rocky brings up a great point, and that was mentioned in that commercial we showed everybody. Detroit and places like Sacramento, California. Will there be a precedent set if we bail out Puerto Rico? We're going to have to bail out all these municipalities that are in over their heads?
Rocky makes a very, very good point. I mean, we could talk about Puerto Rico, but right here stateside, we have states and municipalities across the U.S. that have unfunded pension liabilities that need to be addressed. Taxes keep going up to pay for these situations. How long is that going to last before we have bankruptcies all across the U.S.? And yes, does Puerto Rico set a precedent if, in fact, we go through with the bailout and the taxpayers on the hook for that? I'm sure that all those municipalities are going to point to Puerto Rico as a case-in-point example of it being the right thing to do, when in fact I'm not so sure it is. I think what the right thing to do is to Raul's point, is to address the regulatory expenses, the legal expenses, the spending in general that takes place in places like Puerto Rico to drive up such. I think that's something that we really need to focus in on and examine the books going forward. Now, in the short term, I think Congress has to sit down and figure out how to negotiate their way out of this, but I don't think that the taxpayer should be on the hook for all this all the time.
Right. All right, let's welcome in Shirley, who's calling us from Arkansas. Shirley, what's your comment or question?
Well, real quick, first of all, I think that $72 billion ought to be put into Social Security, and for the system that is supposed to help the people of the U.S., the original people, and quit helping the illegals that come through, which...
well, Shirley, there are no illegals from Puerto Rico. It's a different situation.
I understand that. It's part of the United States, but the United States, I live on Social Security. They don't help us. And we're always helping somebody else instead of the people that was born and raised here.
That's a fair point. I mean, Social Security, there's a lot of folks who have not received those cost of living increases, and you hear about these types of expenses that taxpayers are having to pick up. Raul, I'm sure you can sympathize with Shirley.
Yeah, listen, I sympathize completely, and I think one thing that should alarm everybody about this situation, and to this woman's point as well, because Social Security isn't exactly on rock solid footing itself. Okay, and looking at the case in Puerto Rico, you have to ask yourself, how is it possible that the credit rating agencies continue to give Puerto Rican paper?
Yeah, that's where there should be
You hit it.
some criminal action
Right.
there on these credit agencies. It's the same thing when the 2008
then
housing
you have to ask
crisis.
yourself, is
Right.
the full faith and credit, as it's referred to, of the U.S. government really worth anything anymore? I mean, that's what basically a AAA rating assures you of, right? The full faith and credit. So if the government's not going to step up to bail out Puerto Rico, and it's not going to step up to, perhaps bail out the Social Security, then what the heck is the U.S. government worth?
Right. Well, and I'm wondering, too, if it's possible that some of these bankruptcy rules could change as a result of this. Is that possible, Kyle?
Well, we only have a minute left. I did want to ask these guys one more question because this came up today. United Healthcare pulling out of Obamacare, kind of a lightning round situation. Kyle, we'll start with you in 15 seconds or less. Does this signal the beginning of the end for the Affordable Care Act?
I believe it's certainly a signal that problems are amiss and that it could be a domino effect, yes.
Raul?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's more to come. This is just simply one large insurance company. There's a lot more that are going to be doing the same thing. And this is all going to come to a head come September, October, in the middle of the political battles.
And Kyle, we want to say
Bless you.
bless you, too. Thanks for being with us today. And thanks to our callers, Rocky and Shirley, for their comments and concerns about Puerto Rico. Big deal. This has a lot of folks fired up.
It does. And understandably so. I mean, this is huge. And I was reading that the debt is like $33 million per person that lives there. That's how much it averaged out to.
At that point,
crazy.
the numbers, who knows what they mean. Just still coming up on Newsmax now, Gabe Sherman's going to join us from New York Magazine. We're going to talk about the shakeup inside the Trump campaign and what it could mean for a possible matchup between him and Hillary Clinton.